My dear grandchildren, come and sit with me. My life is like an old book, with brilliant pages but also crumpled, tear-stained chapters that I rarely revisit. Today, I want to tell you a true story, a story about my own past. Not to reopen old wounds, but so that you understand that strength and resilience were sown in our family during the most difficult of days. This is our spiritual legacy. If you're listening from anywhere in the world, please leave a comment and subscribe, because there are truths that need to be spread, even if they might shake your beliefs. There are stories, no matter how painful, that must be told. Before I became the psychologist who helps traumatized children, I was one of those children myself, a girl from Chicago whose childhood was interrupted when the sky fell on her head. My childhood in Chicago was like a fairy tale book, the kind we read and reread, wishing it would never end. I was born in 1950, the daughter of Walter Thompson, a history teacher at Lincoln High School, and Grace Thompson, a seamstress who had a small workshop in the back of our house. We were a simple family, but rich in affection and values. Besides me, there were my two siblings, Martin, 4 years older, and Sarah, a year and a half younger. Our house was on Maple Street, a quiet little street with colorful houses and big yards. Ours was yellow with green window frames. It had a porch out front where Dad had put a big hammock where we would read together on Sunday afternoons. The yard had a small but abundant garden, apple, pear, and cherry trees, and a rhubarb patch that my mother said was miraculous because it seemed to produce endlessly throughout the spring for the homemade remedies and pies she prepared. The morning started early with the crowing of our neighbor, Mr. Peterson's rooster. Mom would prepare oatmeal with cinnamon, which was our breakfast before school. Dad, always elegant, even in his simple clothes, would walk us to Walt Whitman Elementary School, where I studied from 1st to 6th grade. On the way, he would teach us about the plants, the birds, and tell historical tidbits about Chicago. "Clara," he would say, "history isn't just in books, it's in the streets, in the houses, in the people." He always called me by my full name, Clara, unless it was just the two of us. Then he'd sometimes call me Clary, a special nickname that felt like our little secret. And he would show me the marks that early settlers left in our region, the old mansions, the churches with their stories. How I loved those little private lessons on the way to school. After school, I would help Mom in the workshop. She taught me to sew when I was 7. It started with simple stitches. Then she showed me how to do hems, sew on buttons, until at 10, I could already do small alterations on clothes. The clients loved seeing me work by her side. They said I had hands of gold, just like my mother. During school vacations, we would go to Aunt Beatrice's farm, my father's sister, near the Shawnee National Forest. It was a paradise for us city kids. There were horses, cows to milk, chickens to feed, and a crystal-clear creek where we fished for bluegill. At night, we would sit on the porch of the wooden house to listen to Uncle Barry's stories about the Mothman, Bigfoot, and other legends that made us sleep huddled together in fear, but wanting to hear more. The most anticipated celebration of the year was the Chicago 4th of July parade. The whole city would be decorated with flags and banners, and marching bands, colorful floats, and veterans groups would parade down the main streets. Dad would explain the history of the event, the meaning of the symbols on the floats, and the importance of remembering our nation's past. I remember when he would put me on his shoulders so I could get a better view of the impressive floats and the musicians in their crisp uniforms. Those memories are like colorful photographs that I keep in the album of my heart. Our life was simple but full until I was 12, in 1962. That's when the first dark clouds began to form in our hitherto blue sky. Dad started having severe headaches. At first, he hid them, drinking the chamomile tea Mom prepared and continuing to teach his classes, but over time the pain worsened. Sometimes he had to stop mid-sentence, close his eyes, and breathe deeply, waiting for the pain to subside. When we finally convinced him to see a doctor in downtown Chicago, the diagnosis was a bolt from the blue, a brain aneurysm. The doctor explained that Dad needed urgent surgery, a procedure that was not only high risk but also far beyond our financial means. The illness stretched on for months, a slow-moving storm over our family as we scrambled to raise money. Mom sewed day and night, Martin delivered groceries after school, and I sold homemade cookies. But despite all our efforts, Time was against us. The end came suddenly on an August night in 1963. While we were having dinner, Dad dropped his fork, put his hand to his head, and collapsed. In that moment, he was gone, leaving a silence that would never be filled again. I had just turned 13. Suddenly, I found myself having to be strong, not just for myself, but for Mom, who seemed to have lost her footing, and for Sarah, who was so overwhelmed by grief, she seemed lost in her own world. Martin, at 17, took on the role of the man of the house, but he was just a boy trying to look like an adult. Dad's death left more than an emotional void. It also left a hole in our finances. Without his salary, Mom's small sewing business wasn't enough to support the family. The bills started piling up. Overdue rent, the tab at Mr. Miller's store getting longer and longer, school fees we could no longer pay. That's when Mom, in an act of desperation, wrote to my father's only relative, who was well off enough to help us, my grandfather, Arthur. He lived in Naperville, a city a few hours from Chicago, and was practically a stranger to us. Dad and he had grown distant years before, for reasons that were never clear to us children. The few times Dad mentioned his own father, a shadow would cross his face, and he would quickly change the subject. 3 days after the letter, my grandfather Arthur showed up at our door. Tall, with salt and pepper hair, well-groomed, and in an impeccable dark suit, he seemed an imposing and distant figure. He carried an expensive leather briefcase and a thick envelope of money that he handed to my mother without much ceremony. "I've come to take care of my son's family," he said in a voice that seemed kind, but somehow sent a shiver down my spine. At that moment, I saw my mother cry with relief for the first time since Dad's funeral. You can feel the family's relief in that moment, a lifeline in a sea of despair. But sometimes, the hand that pulls you from the water isn't there to save you, but to drag you into a different, deeper kind of darkness. What Clara's mother saw as a savior was something else entirely. What she didn't know, what none of us could imagine, was that this money, which seemed like a lifeline, was actually the ticket to my worst nightmare. My grandfather Arthur didn't take long to organize our lives, as he put it. In just 1 week, he paid all our debts, enrolled us in a private school, the Street Rita's Academy, and rented a bigger house for us in the Lincoln Park neighborhood, the most affluent in Chicago. My mother, exhausted by grief and overwhelmed by the sudden reprieve from financial ruin, saw him not as a distant relative, but as a savior. She clung to his every decision with the desperation of a drowning person clinging to the only lifeboat in sight, too broken to question its destination. I know many of you might question my mother. Please, do not be quick to judge her. Grief is like a thick fog that can blind you, and desperation will make you grasp for any outstretched hand, even if it belongs to a monster. She saw only a savior, because her heart was too broken to see anything else. "Grace," he said to my mother, about a month after his arrival, "this city offers no opportunities for the children. I have businesses in Miami and a big house there. We should move, start over in a place where Walter's ghost isn't on every corner." And so, at 13, I found myself leaving behind the city where I was born, my school friends, the afternoons helping Mom in the workshop, the stories Dad told about every corner of those streets. Every object we packed into the cardboard boxes seemed to carry a piece of my childhood that would be left behind. Miami was very different from Chicago. Known for its beaches, it was a city that was beginning to transform into a tourist destination, with hotels and inns popping up everywhere. Our new house was in an area away from the city center, a large, modern building with 3 bedrooms upstairs and, on the ground floor, an office where Grandpa spent hours locked away, talking on the phone and writing numbers in notebooks he kept under lock and key. "They're important business matters," he would explain, vaguely when someone asked. "This is how I guarantee your future." In the first few months, the move seemed to have been positive. Mom was more relaxed without the pressure of debt. Martin got a part-time job as an office assistant at one of the hotels, and Sarah and I were enrolled in Our Lady of Grace School. I even got a new dress for the first day of school, something that hadn't happened in a long time. It was during our 4th month in Miami, around Christmas time, that I noticed the first changes in my grandfather's behavior toward me. Small gestures that, in isolation, might seem innocent. A compliment about how I was becoming a young lady, a hand that lingered a little too long on my shoulder when he greeted me, the way his eyes followed me when I crossed the living room. At first, I thought I was imagining things, until that Friday, when everything really started to change. Mom had gone to visit a friend she had met at church, Martin was at his job, and Sarah had gone to a classmate's house to work on a science project. I was home alone, reading a book on the porch, when my grandfather came home earlier than usual. "Clara," he said, his voice softening in a way that made me strangely uncomfortable. "Clary, that's what your father used to call you, isn't it? I need your help with some documents. Come with me to the office." I followed him without suspecting a thing. In the office, he closed the door and showed me some folders. "I'm organizing the family papers," he explained. "I want you to know about the business for when you're older." As he showed me some documents, he began to talk about my father. "Walter never had a head for business," he commented. "That's why you all struggled. But you," and here he touched my face in a way that made me freeze, "you seem to have inherited my intelligence, not his." I instinctively stepped back, and he smiled in a way that didn't reach his eyes. "Don't be afraid of me, Clara. I'm your grandfather. I'm here to take care of you." That night, I couldn't sleep. There was something in his eyes, in the tone of his voice, that left me uneasy. I told Sarah, who shared a room with me, but she said I was imagining things, that Grandpa was just a sweet old man. The following week, he called me to the office again. This time, he said he needed to show me one of his ventures so I would understand where the money that supported us came from. "Tomorrow is Saturday," he said. "We're going to take a little trip. Don't tell your mother. I want to surprise her later." On Saturday morning, I got into his car, a shiny black Lincoln Continental. "Where are we going, Grandpa?" I asked, as he drove on a highway leading out of the city. "A special place," he replied simply, with that half-smile that had become familiar and increasingly disturbing. After about a 30-minute drive, we turned onto a dirt road that led to a building hidden among trees. A discreet sign read, "Traveler's Rest, Privacy and Comfort." It was a complex of small cabins, separated from each other by well-kept gardens, each with an individual garage that prevented parked cars from being seen. "What is this, Grandpa?" I asked, still feeling a knot in my stomach. Even at 13, I had heard of motels, places where couples went for privacy. "It's one of my businesses," he explained with studied casualness. "A place for travelers to rest. I have a special room here where I keep important documents. I'll show you." He parked the car in one of the garages and led me to cabin number 5. When he opened the door, I saw a typical motel room. A large bed, mirrors on the walls, reddish indirect lighting, a mini fridge in the corner. No documents, no office. "Grandpa," I said, stopping at the door, not wanting to go in. "I don't see any documents here." "Come in, Clara," he insisted, gripping my arm tightly. "I'll explain everything inside." What happened in that cabin number 5 is something I tried for years to erase from my memory, but some wounds are too deep to ever fully heal. On that Saturday morning, while the air held a crisp winter chill and the pale December sun streamed through the cracks in the blinds, I came to know a kind of pain that no child should ever know. A pain that was not just physical, but one that pierced the soul, destroying trust, innocence, the sense of security that every child deserves to have. "Turn around now. You're going to feel it," he whispered, in a voice that no longer seemed like my grandfather's, but that of a stranger, a monster disguised as family. And I felt it. I felt as if I were being torn apart, inside and out. I felt as if 1,000 needles were piercing not only my body, but my dignity, my humanity. I closed my eyes tightly and tried to transport myself to another place. I imagined I was in Chicago, in the yard of our old house, listening to Dad tell stories about the stars. I imagined the tears streaming down my face were raindrops on a summer afternoon, but the reality was too brutal to completely escape. When it was over, he told me to take a shower. "This stays between us," he said while I trembled under the water, trying in vain to wash away a filth that no water could ever cleanse. "If you tell anyone, your mother and your siblings will go back to being poor. Is that what you want?" On the way back home, he stopped at an ice cream parlor and bought me a strawberry ice cream, my favorite flavor. I couldn't eat it. My stomach was in knots, and every breath felt like a monumental effort. Holding the cold, sweet cone in my trembling hand, I felt a wave of nausea. He had just shattered my world, yet here he was, offering me a treat as if we had just spent a pleasant afternoon together. This simple act of buying ice cream was more twisted than the violence itself. It was a lesson in silence, a bribe for my soul, a way of saying, our terrible secret is wrapped in the sweetness of normalcy, and you will learn to swallow it. In that moment, the taste of strawberry became the taste of shame. You see, my dears, evil doesn't always come with growls and bared fangs. Sometimes, it wears a kind face and offers you ice cream. It does this to confuse you, to make you question if your pain is real, to wrap the horror in a sweet coating and force you to swallow it in silence. You're special, Clara, he said, as if that were a consolation, as if what he had done was a distorted form of affection. Other people wouldn't understand our special relationship. The visits to the Traveler's Rest became a terrible routine. Always on Saturday mornings, when Mom was at the market or at church, always with the same excuse to take me documents to organize, business to learn, lessons about the future. And always the same whispered phrase that became the trigger for my nightmares for decades. Turn around now, you're going to feel it. At school, I started to withdraw. My grades, which had always been good, plummeted. I couldn't concentrate in class. I couldn't sleep at night. I could barely eat. I lost so much weight that my ribs became visible, which only made Mom worry about my health, never suspecting the real reason for my decline. It's adolescence, my grandfather would say with false concern. And adjusting to the new city, she'll get better. Martin, busy with work and his own studies, barely noticed my transformation. Sarah, who shared a room with me, noticed that I cried every night, but her attempts to comfort me hit my wall of silence. How could I explain the inexplicable? How could I destroy the financial security of our family, which had suffered so much after Dad's death? Once, I tried to resist. It was a Saturday in October, and I had pretended to be sick with a fever and a headache. I can't go today, Grandpa, I said, trembling under the covers. I feel really sick. He just smiled, that cold smile that never reached his eyes, and replied, That's fine, Clara. Maybe I'll take Sarah in your place. She's a young lady now, isn't she? About the right age. And just like that, the trap was sealed. It wasn't just about her own survival anymore. Clara was now the unwitting shield for her little sister. This is the moment a victim is forced to become a silent guardian, a burden no child should ever have to carry. Her silence from here on out is an act of protection. I never pretended to be sick again. The thought of my little sister going through the same hell was unbearable. So I went, week after week, month after month, carrying that terrible weight in silence, becoming an unwitting shield to protect the rest of my family. It was during one of those visits, almost a year after the first time, that I discovered something that would change the course of my life. While my grandfather was in the bathroom, I saw a folder of documents on the nightstand. Driven by a mix of curiosity and desperation for any information that could help me, I quickly opened it. Inside, I found contracts, deeds, business licenses, all with my grandfather Arthur Thompson's name as the owner of the Traveler's Rest. There were also bank statements showing the establishment's monthly profits, considerable sums that explained how he could afford our new house, the private school, the expensive clothes. The revelation hit me like a lightning bolt. My grandfather wasn't just my tormentor. He was the owner of the place that had become my personal hell. The money that fed our family, that paid for our education, that gave us a roof over our heads, came from those very walls that witnessed my degradation week after week. That was a crueler violation, you know. To realize that you are living off the very destruction of your own soul. It was as if every bite of food was seasoned with my tears, and the walls of our home were built from my own shame. I knew then that I wasn't just a victim. I was the fuel for his engine of perversion. That night, I cried as I had never cried before. I clutched the small silver crucifix my father had given me for my 10th birthday, the only object of his I still had. And it was there, feeling the cold metal against my face, hot with fever and desperation, that I began to imagine a way out of that hell. Dad, I whispered to the crucifix as if he could hear me. Give me strength. Help me find a way to end this. A spark of determination ignited within me that night. I didn't know how yet, but I swore to myself that I would find a way to stop my grandfather, to expose his crimes, to free not only myself, but all the victims those cabins might have housed over the years. What I didn't know yet was that the answer would lie in the very element that symbolizes both destruction and purification: fire. The following months were like living in a dark room where every shadow was a threat and every noise made me flinch. The Saturday ritual continued, relentless as the seasons. Summer, fall, winter, spring. The trees around the Traveler's Rest changed their leaves, but my fate seemed as immutable as stone. At 15, I was no longer the cheerful girl from Chicago. My body was growing, but my soul seemed to shrink with each visit to that place. At school, I became a ghost, present in the classrooms but absent in spirit. My old passions, drawing, reading, dreaming of traveling the world, were replaced by a single fixed thought: survive until the next day. The constant tension transformed me physically. My hair, once shiny, became dull and started to fall out in clumps. I developed a nervous tic, an uncontrollable twitch in my left eye when I got anxious, which was practically all the time. At night, I had nightmares so violent that I would wake Sarah with my muffled screams. "What's wrong with you, Clara?" she would ask, hugging me in the darkness of our room. "Why won't you tell me?" But how could I explain the unexplainable? How could I share a pain so deep that there were no words in our vocabulary to describe it? And worse, how could I risk my grandfather fulfilling his threat to do to her what he did to me? Mom also noticed my transformation. She took me to doctors in Miami who prescribed vitamins, tonics, even sedatives. "Your daughter is suffering from nerves," they would say. "It's common in teenagers." None of them ever asked what was truly afflicting me. None of them looked beyond the physical symptoms to see the shattered soul behind them. My grandfather, with his calculated cruelty, found ways to intensify my torment. He started taking me to other cabins, not just number 5. "We need to vary it up," he would say, as if he were talking about a restaurant or an outing. Each new cabin was a new setting for the same nightmare, a new traumatic memory to add to my collection of horrors. In one of those new cabins, number 8, something happened that made my situation even more unbearable. It was a Saturday in March of 1965. I had already been suffering the weekly abuse for nearly a year and a half. That day, upon arriving at the Traveler's Rest, I noticed another car parked near my grandfather's Lincoln. A middle-aged man was talking to him outside the cabin. "Clara," my grandfather called to me, "come meet my friend Marvin. He's a partner in some of my businesses." I approached reluctantly, head down, feeling the stranger's gaze evaluating me as if I were merchandise. My grandfather placed a hand on my shoulder, squeezing hard enough to prevent me from running. "Isn't she a beauty, my granddaughter?" he said with a sick pride in his voice. "Certainly," the man replied with a smile that chilled me to the bone. "You were right, Arthur. She's special." I didn't immediately understand what was happening. Only when my grandfather pushed me inside the cabin and the man followed us, closing the door behind him, did the reality hit me with terrible clarity. My grandfather was going to share his property with another predator. "No, Grandpa," I pleaded, tears already streaming down my face. "Please, no." "Calm down, Clara," he replied with that false sweetness I knew all too well. "Marvin just wants to get to know you better. He's an important friend. We need him for our business." What followed was a torture even worse than all the previous ones. 2 monsters instead of 1. 2 voices whispering orders. 2 pairs of hands leaving invisible marks on my soul. I closed my eyes and transported myself far away, to a place where there were no cabins, no motels, no grandfathers, no business friends. A place where I was just a 15-year-old girl, innocent and whole. When it was all over and we returned home, I was in pieces, not just emotionally, but physically as well. Pains I had never felt before, bleeding that wouldn't stop. I locked myself in the bathroom for hours, trying to stop the blood, crying silently so no one would hear me. Sarah knocked on the door, worried. "Clara, are you okay? You've been in there for so long." "Yes," I lied, my voice choked. "I'm just not feeling well, girl stuff." That night, a high fever came, violent, as if my body were on fire. I was delirious, calling for my father, begging him to save me. Mom, frightened, called a doctor who diagnosed an infection, prescribed antibiotics, and rest. My grandfather feigned concern, sitting by my bedside, holding my hand in front of the others. "Everything will be all right, my dear," he would say, while his eyes sent me a clear message. This is what happens when you don't cooperate. The fever passed, but something inside me had changed. A spark of rage began to grow, mixing with the fear and shame. I began to understand that my grandfather had no limits, that the situation would only get worse with time, that maybe one day he would decide that Sarah was special too. It was at that point that I began to seriously think about escaping. I saved every penny I could get. Coins forgotten in pockets, change from purchases, even a dollar bill I found on the street. I hid the money inside an old teddy bear, planning to save enough for a bus ticket to anywhere far from there. But where would I go? Who would believe me? And how could I abandon my mother and siblings to the mercy of that monster? The weight of responsibility was crushing for a 5-year-old. I tried to find help at school. There was a teacher, Mrs. Gable, who taught literature and always looked at me with genuine concern. One day after class, she asked to talk to me. "Clara," she said softly, "I can tell something is wrong. You were a brilliant student, and now you can barely concentrate. You're getting thinner every day, with deep dark circles under your eyes. You can trust me if you need help." For a moment, I thought about telling her everything. The words rose to my throat, ready to jump to freedom, but then I remembered the threats, the consequences, and moreover, who would believe that a respected man in the city, a successful businessman, would be capable of such monstrosity? "I'm fine, Mrs. Gable," I replied, swallowing the cry for help I wanted to give. "I just haven't been sleeping well." Mrs. Gable didn't insist, but she gave me a book. "Maybe this will help on your sleepless nights," she said. It was an anthology of poems by Emily Dickinson, an American poet who wrote about overcoming and resilience. That book would become my refuge on the darkest nights. April arrived, and with it, a change in my grandfather's routine. He started spending more time at the motel during the week, not just on Saturdays. "Business is growing," he explained to my mother. "We're renovating some cabins, improving the facilities." It was during one of these renovations that fate put the key to my liberation in my hands. My grandfather, proud of the improvements, decided to take me to see the work on a Tuesday after school. "I want you to see how we're progressing," he said with that sick enthusiasm. "After all, one day all of this will be yours." The thought of inheriting that place of nightmares made my stomach churn, but I went, as always, without a choice. When we arrived, he showed me the renovated cabins with perverse excitement. "Look at the new showers, the more comfortable beds, the surround sound system." He spoke as if he were showing off a luxury hotel, not a den of abuse. In one of the cabins under renovation, number 3, I noticed several gallons of chemical products stacked in a corner. Turpentine, kerosene, paint removers, solvents. "What's all this, Grandpa?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Renovation supplies," he explained, distracted by the details of the new decor. "Solvents to remove the old wallpaper, kerosene to clean the stains off the wooden floor." In that instant, an idea began to form in my mind. A terrible, desperate idea, but one that represented a chance for liberation. I remembered from chemistry class how those products were highly flammable, how a single match could turn it all into an inferno, a real inferno, not just the metaphorical one I was living in. I watched carefully where the keys were kept. I saw when the foreman, Mr. Wallace, hung them on a discreet hook behind the reception desk. There were 2 keys on the ring, a small golden key for the storage closet and a larger silver master key for the cabins. They were my potential salvation. That night, I couldn't sleep. The idea of the fire consumed my thoughts like the flames would consume that place of horrors. It was wrong, it was dangerous, it was criminal. But it would be justice. In my trembling teenage hands rested the most difficult decision anyone could ever face. Destroy to rebuild, burn to purify. What if someone got hurt? What if the fire got out of control? Could I live with that guilt? I spent the whole night awake, weighing the possibilities, calculating the risks, searching for alternatives. And when the sun rose, bringing a new day, I had made my decision. I didn't know exactly how yet, but I knew that the fire that had burned inside me for so long, consuming my childhood and my innocence, would soon find expression in the flames that would consume the traveler's rest. May arrived with a heat unusual for that time of year in Miami, a heat that seemed to reflect the fire growing inside me, no longer just of pain and shame, but now also of a fierce determination. For weeks, I observed the motel's routine, memorized schedules, studied the movement of guests and employees. With each forced visit, I mentally recorded more details. The location of the fire extinguishers, the layout of the exits, the times of least activity. In my school notebook, disguised as class notes, I recorded everything. Between mathematical equations, I hid the employees' shift change times. In the margins of history texts, I drew small maps of the cabins. No one would ever suspect that worn-out notebook held a 15-year-old girl's plans to destroy her own grandfather's empire of perversion. The trigger, the exact moment that served as the last straw, occurred on a Saturday afternoon, the 15th of May 1965, a date that would be burned into my memory. That morning, my grandfather picked me up earlier than usual. "We have an important engagement today," he said with that cold smile I knew all too well. Something in his tone, a sick enthusiasm, made my stomach churn more than usual. When we arrived at the Traveler's Rest, he didn't take me to any of the usual cabins, but to a different one, number 12, the most secluded, almost hidden among the trees. When he opened the door, I saw we were not alone. 3 middle-aged men were waiting, sitting in armchairs arranged in a semicircle. I recognized one of them, Marvin, the partner, who had participated in my torment before. The other 2 were strangers, but they had the same predatory gaze I had learned to identify and fear. "Gentlemen," my grandfather announced, pushing me forward like someone displaying a trophy. As promised, my granddaughter Clara. A rarity, isn't she? The air seemed to vanish from my lungs. The ringing in my ears drowned out the voices, but I could see the smiles, the exchanged glances, the bills passing from hand to hand. That's when I understood. My grandfather wasn't just abusing me, he was selling me. "No," I whispered, backing away until I hit the wall. "No, please." One of the men, bald with a grayish mustache, took a step forward. "Don't be shy, little girl. Your grandfather assured us you're very special." My grandfather grabbed my arm forcefully, his fingers leaving red marks on my skin. "Behave, Clara," he whispered, with a clear threat in his voice. "Remember your mother, your siblings. What will happen if you don't cooperate?" In that moment, something inside me broke. Not in defeat, but with a crystal clarity. I saw my future unfold before me like a horror movie, years and years of being used, sold, destroyed, bit by bit. And then, when I was too old, maybe my sister Sarah would take my place. The cycle would continue endlessly. "I need to use the bathroom," I said, trying to control the tremor in my voice. "Be quick," my grandfather ordered, pointing to a door on the side. In the small bathroom of cabin 12, I looked at my reflection in the mirror. A girl too thin, too pale, with eyes that seemed to belong to someone much older. That wasn't me. It was just an empty shell of what I had once been. And it was there, in that moment of confrontation with myself, that I made my final decision. I opened the bathroom window small, but large enough for a skeletal teenager as I had become. With one last look at the closed door, I climbed out the window, landing in the tall weeds behind the cabin. I ran. Not towards freedom, but towards the only ending I could imagine. My mind was a blizzard of white noise, every rational thought obliterated by a single burning need: to make it stop. To make this place stop. My feet found their way to cabin number 3. The memory of flammable cans a homing beacon in the chaos of my terror. The door was unlocked. Fate. The acrid smell of chemicals filled my lungs, a scent of poison and promise. My hands, disconnected from my mind, grabbed a gallon of turpentine. It was heavy, but my adrenaline-fueled strength was boundless. I didn't plan. I didn't think. I acted. I stumbled back towards cabin 12, sloshing the liquid in a trail behind me. Let them follow this path. Let this be the road to hell that they built. I emptied the can onto the dry wooden siding of the cabin, the liquid greedily soaking into the timber. From my pocket, my fingers found a small book of matches, a forgotten remnant of a science project, a relic from a life that no longer existed. My hands shook so violently it took 3 tries to strike one. The tiny flame flickered, a fragile life in the face of so much death. I didn't whisper a word. My entire being was a scream that had no sound. I tossed the match. That was more than just a match. It was a desperate act of purification, a final scream from a soul that refused to be extinguished. In these flames, Clara wasn't just destroying a place, she was trying to burn away her own personal hell. But what rises from such ashes? The answer will surprise you. In that small, flickering flame, I saw not just an end, but a beginning. It was not an act of hatred, my dears, but an act of desperate purification. I had to burn down that prison for the chance to see the sky again, even if I knew I would be covered in its ashes. The world didn't just catch fire, it exploded. A whoosh of sound and heat threw me to the ground as the trail of turpentine ignited like a fuse, a roaring serpent of fire racing towards the cabin. I heard confused shouts from inside, quickly turning to screams of panic. The door burst open, but I didn't stay to watch. I scrambled to my feet and ran like never before, down the dirt road, leaving the apocalypse I had created behind me. I ran until my lungs burned as much as the cabins behind me. I ran until my muscles screamed in pain. I ran until the ground under my feet turned from packed dirt to asphalt. On the highway, a truck driver stopped when he saw me. A dirty, panting teenager with eyes wide with terror and determination. "Girl, what happened?" he asked, pointing behind me, where a column of black smoke was already rising into the sky. "Fire," was all I could manage to say. "A terrible accident." He offered to take me to the city without asking any more questions. On the way, looking in the rearview mirror, I saw the Miami sky turn black as sirens began to wail in the distance. What I had done was terrible. I knew it, perhaps unforgivable. But in that moment, feeling the cool wind coming through the truck window, touching my face wet with tears and sweat, I felt something I hadn't felt in almost 2 years. Freedom. I didn't know what awaited me, whether my grandfather had survived, if I would be discovered, if I would spend the rest of my life on the run. I only knew that for the first time since my father's death, I had taken control of my own destiny, and that the flames consuming the traveler's rest were somehow purifying my soul, burning away the cobwebs of terror and shame that had imprisoned me for so long. When the truck driver dropped me off in downtown Miami, I walked to a small park and sat on a bench, watching the city life go on as usual, oblivious to my personal torment, oblivious to my revenge, oblivious to my liberation. "And now, Clara," I asked myself as the sun began to set, "where do you go?" The answer came like a whisper of the wind in the leaves of the park's trees. Anywhere but back. The news of the fire at the Traveler's Rest spread through Miami like wildfire. "Tragedy on the highway," screamed the headlines of the local newspapers the next day. "4 dead in arson at motel." Sitting in the waiting room of the bus station, the newspaper trembling in my hands, I read the details with a mixture of horror and relief. According to the report, 4 men had died in the fire. My grandfather Arthur Thompson, his business partner Marvin, and 2 other men identified as businessmen from Chicago. The police suspected arson due to the fire's spread pattern and the strong smell of fuel. "Authorities are looking for witnesses and a teenage girl seen in the vicinity," the last paragraph said. My heart raced. Someone had seen me. I couldn't go back home, not after what I had done. Despite all the suffering my grandfather had caused me, I had taken human lives. 4 of them. Even if they were the lives of monsters, the weight of that reality was almost unbearable for my 5-year-old self. With the money I had saved in the teddy bear, almost $50, I bought a ticket to the farthest place I could, Denver, Colorado. It was a city where no one knew me, far enough from Florida to give me some sense of security. During the long bus ride, which lasted almost 2 days with several transfers, I had time to think about what would become of my family. Mom, Martin, Sarah. Were they suffering from my disappearance? Did they know about my grandfather's involvement in the fire? Would they ever find out what he had done to me? Or would they just consider me a troubled teenager who ran away from home? These questions tormented me for hundreds of miles as I watched the landscape of the American South gradually transform into the mountains of the West. I arrived in Denver on a cold May morning with only the clothes on my back, my few remaining dollars, and a new name I had decided to adopt, Laura Campos. I had to leave Clara Thompson in the past, at least for now. In the first few days, I slept in a city shelter and desperately looked for work. My age was an obstacle. Who would hire a 15-year-old girl with no documents, no references, apparently a runaway? But necessity made me creative. I started washing dishes in a small diner where the owner, Mrs. Davis, didn't ask too many questions when she saw my frightened eyes and hands willing to work. "We all have our secrets, kid," she said simply. "The important thing is to keep moving forward." Mrs. Davis was a middle-aged widow with a grown daughter who lived in Boulder. She let me sleep in a small room at the back of the diner in exchange for help in the kitchen and with cleaning. The pay was little, but it was enough to start rebuilding my life. The nights, however, were difficult. The nightmares came without fail. The fire, the screams, my grandfather's face contorting in the flames. I would wake up in a cold sweat, stifling screams so as not to alarm Mrs. Davis. During the day, any loud noise made me jump. A man with a voice similar to my grandfather's would leave me paralyzed with fear. The simple smell of kerosene used to clean the stove caused instant nausea. After 3 months in Denver, just as I was starting to adjust to my new life, I received the first blow of fate. One morning, I saw my face in the local newspaper, an old-school photo under the headline, "Florida Police Search for Teenager Missing After Fatal Fire." My whole body went cold. The article said they were looking for me not as a suspect, but as a possible victim of kidnapping or worse. The authorities' theory was that the fire might be related to a child exploitation ring and that I might have been a victim who escaped or was taken during the chaos. "The miner's family, residents of Miami, pleads for information on her whereabouts," the text read. There was even a statement from my mother. "We just want to know that our daughter is safe. If anyone has seen her, please get in touch." I cried reading those words. Mom was suffering, and I was the cause. But how could I go back? How could I explain what had happened without revealing the truth about Grandpa, without incriminating myself for the fire? That same afternoon, I made the decision that would once again change the course of my life. I wrote a letter. I didn't tell the whole truth. I couldn't, but I said enough. "Dear Mom, I am okay and safe. I can't come back now, and maybe not for a long time. There are things about Grandpa Arthur that you don't know, things too terrible to put in this letter. One day, when it's safer, I will tell you everything. Please take care of Sarah and Martin. Tell them I love them, and know that even though I'm far away, you are always in my heart. With love, your daughter." I mailed the letter to an address in Kansas City, asking a contact of Mrs. Davis to mail it from there to make it harder to trace me. I don't know if that letter ever reached my mother, but writing those words gave me some peace. 6 months after my arrival in Denver, Mrs. Davis introduced me to an elderly couple who frequented her diner, Eleanor and Harold Finch. They were retired teachers, childless, and were looking for someone to help around the house and keep them company. They offered me a room, meals, and the chance to go back to school in exchange for help with household chores. "You have the eyes of someone who needs a chance," Eleanor said, holding my hands in hers. "And we have a house that's too big for 2 old folks." Thus began the second phase of my new life. Eleanor quickly discovered I didn't have proper documents, and without asking questions about my past, she used her contacts as a former school principal to resolve the situation. "Laura Campos," she said one day, handing me a birth certificate. "Born in Denver, parents deceased in an accident. Our great-niece, who came to live with us." The document was a fake, of course, but it looked authentic enough to allow me to attend school and eventually get legitimate jobs. With the Finches, I found more than a refuge. I found a family. They treated me with a respect and affection I barely remembered was possible. Harold, with his infinite patience, helped me with my math and science lessons. Eleanor, noticing my interest in reading, introduced me to her vast personal library. "Books show us other worlds," she would say, "but they also help us understand our own." It was in the psychology books in Eleanor's library that I began to understand what had happened. Words like abuse, trauma, and post-traumatic stress took on meaning. I began to understand that what my grandfather had done was not my fault, that I had been the victim of a predator who used his power and position to hurt me. As for the fire, well, that was more complicated. In my darkest moments, I wondered if I was a murderer, if I deserved to be punished. At other times, I saw my action as self-defense, not just for myself, but for all the other potential victims my grandfather and his friends could have harmed. The following year, at 16, I got a small job at the public library, organizing books and helping visitors. The quiet environment, surrounded by knowledge, was therapeutic for my still recovering mind. It was there, among the bookshelves, that I met Dr. Joyce Roth, a psychologist who came to research materials for a course she taught at the local university. We started talking about literature and gradually about psychology. She sensed my emotional scars, even before I mentioned anything about my past. "Laura," she said one day, using the name I had adopted, "if you ever want to talk about what hurt you, I'm here. Sometimes carrying certain stories alone is too heavy a burden." Initially, I resisted. The fear of being discovered, judged, or even arrested for the fire was paralyzing. But slowly, in cautious conversations, I began to talk about a friend who had suffered abuse and sought a drastic way out. Dr. Roth understood the game, but she respected my pace and my disguises. Those conversations were my first experience with therapy, albeit informal and disguised. They planted the seed of what would become my future calling. At 18, with the support of the Finches and a partial scholarship, I enrolled in the psychology program at the University of Colorado, Denver. My personal experience had shown me the transformative power of understanding the human mind, both the aggressors and the victims. I wanted to use that knowledge to help other people who, like me, carried invisible wounds. During my sophomore year of college, something happened that would change everything again. One day, returning home after classes, I found an unknown woman talking with Eleanor in the living room. When I walked in, they both fell silent, and the visitor stood up, visibly trembling. "Clara?" she said, her voice choked. "Is it really you?" It was my mother. In that instant, my past and present worlds collided. My mother, Grace, older and thinner than I remembered, had found me after almost 5 years of searching through private investigators, newspaper ads, and even psychics. As she told me later, she had never given up on finding me. The reunion was intense, and complex hugs, tears, half-explanations. Eleanor, sensing the delicacy of the situation, gave us privacy, though I knew we would have much to talk about later. When we were finally alone, my mother took my hands and said, "Honey, I know what happened. I know what your grandfather did to you." The shock left me speechless. "How could you know?" "After you disappeared, the police launched a major investigation. They knew it was arson, not an accident." At first, she took a deep breath. They thought it was a rival business deal gone wrong, or something related to organized crime, given the men who died with him. They investigated mob connections for months, never once suspecting a teenage girl. But while they were digging into his finances for a motive, they found everything, Clara. The ledgers, the photos, evidence of what he was doing. They realized the motel was a front for something monstrous. Other men were arrested. There were other victims. The revelation hit me like a bolt of lightning. "So," I whispered, "they never suspected me for the fire?" My mother shook her head. By the time they understood the true evil of that place, the fire was old news. They believed you were another victim who had either escaped or been taken. They were looking for you to save you, not to blame you. For 5 long years, she carried the weight of 4 lives, a burden arguably heavier than any of the abuse. And in this single moment, with those 5 words from her mother, that weight vanished. This is her true liberation, the moment Clara can finally begin to heal without the shadow of a crime she didn't commit. The air left my lungs in a single, shuddering gasp. For 5 long years, I had carried the weight of 4 lives on my back, a burden more terrible than any of the abuse. In that single moment, with just a few words from my mother, that weight vanished. I learned then that sometimes the chains that bind us are not made of iron, but of the stories we believe about ourselves. For 5 years, I had built my life on the identity of a fugitive. Every siren in the distance, every knock on the door, had sent a jolt of ice through my veins. I was not just a survivor. In the darkest corners of my mind, I was a murderer. But with those 5 words from my mother, the chains I hadn't even realized were still wrapped around my soul simply turned to dust. The weight of 4 lives, a burden that had hunched my shoulders and haunted my nights, was lifted. I wasn't a monster, I was just a girl who had fought back. In that moment, an enormous weight I had carried for years began to lift. I was no longer a fugitive, a wanted arsonist. I was just a survivor who had found a way to rebuild her life. My mother and I talked for hours. She told me that Sarah and Martin were fine, that we had received a substantial insurance settlement from the motel and my grandfather's other businesses. Dirty money, she said, but I decided to use it for something good. I opened a support house for women and children who are victims of violence in Chicago. That revelation filled me with an unexpected pride. My mother, whom I had feared I had abandoned to her fate, had found strength and purpose in the tragedy. At the end of that day, I faced a difficult choice. Continue as Laura Campos, the psychology student with a promising future in Denver, or go back to being Clara Thompson, the survivor who could finally confront her past without fear. I chose a middle path. I continued my studies as Laura. After all my academic records were in that name. But I re-established regular contact with my family, who began to visit me periodically. Eleanor and Harold, who had become my unofficial adoptive parents, embraced this family expansion with the generosity that always characterized them. When I graduated with a degree in psychology at 23, 4 people applauded proudly in the audience. Eleanor, Harold, my mother Grace, and my sister Sarah, who had followed in my footsteps and was also studying psychology. It was in my undergraduate thesis, titled Resilience and Reconstruction: Pathways to Overcoming Severe Trauma, that I finally academically confronted my own past. Although the paper didn't mention my personal story, every word was fueled by my journey from the ashes to reconstruction. After graduation, I specialized in child trauma and began working in a clinic for young survivors of violence. My personal experience gave me a special sensitivity to identify the subtle signs of abuse that many professionals overlooked, to understand the silences and metaphors through which traumatized children tried to communicate their suffering. At 30, already established as a respected psychologist, I made another important decision. I moved to Havenwood, Illinois, a small town where no one knew my history, but which was a reasonable distance from both Denver and Chicago, allowing me to stay in touch with everyone I loved. It was in Havenwood where I met Leonard, a local school history teacher and a widower with 2 young children. Our relationship grew slowly, built on friendship and mutual respect. When he asked me to marry him a year later, I faced my last great challenge, telling him the truth about my past. One winter evening, sitting in front of the fireplace in his house, I recounted my entire story. The abuse, the fire, the escape, the false identity, the reconstruction. When I finished, I was trembling, sure that I had destroyed any chance of a future together. Leonard remained silent for long minutes that felt like an eternity. Then he simply took my hands and said, "Clara or Laura, the name doesn't matter. The strong, compassionate, and extraordinary woman you've become, that's who I love." We were married the following summer in a small ceremony that brought together my blood family and my chosen family. I became a mother to Leonard's children, Nathan and Emily, and later we had our own daughter, Ella, named in honor of Eleanor, who had already passed away, but whose legacy of kindness and wisdom I wanted to perpetuate. Over the years, I continued my work as a psychologist, specializing more and more in child trauma and advocating for child protection policies. I published articles, gave lectures, and although I never publicly revealed my personal story, I used it as fuel to make a difference in the lives of other victims. The ashes of the Traveler's Rest had long since scattered to the wind, but from the flames I once lit in my desperate adolescence emerged not only destruction, but also, eventually, the light of knowledge, purpose, and the healing I was able to bring to so many others. The fire I once used to free myself metaphorically became the fire that lights the way for others who, like me, need to find hope in the most desperate situations. Today, at 75, I live a life that the girl from Chicago could never have imagined. My house in Havenwood, with its wide porch and view of the oak trees, has become a safe harbor, not only for me but for many who need a place to heal their invisible wounds. It's been 45 years since I settled in this town. Leonard, my life partner for nearly 4 decades, passed away 5 years ago after a battle with cancer. It was a profound loss, but different from the traumatic losses of my youth. This one I could face with the serenity of someone who knows they lived a true and full love. Our children grew up well. Nathan, the eldest, is a forestry engineer and works in the Monarch Butterfly Biosphere Reserve. Emily became a university professor, following in her father's footsteps, and teaches anthropology at the University of Illinois. Our Ella, to my surprise and joy, chose psychology as her profession, and today coordinates a psychosocial support center in Naperville. Between the 3 of them, they gave me 6 wonderful grandchildren who fill my house with noise and joy when they come to visit during the holidays. Although I'm officially retired, I still keep a small practice at home where I see 2 or 3 patients a week, usually special cases that other professionals refer to me, knowing my experience with complex trauma. They are mainly adolescents and young adults who have suffered abuse or violence similar to what I faced. When these young people come to me with downcast eyes, slumped shoulders, carrying burdens too heavy for their age, I see reflections of the girl I once was. And when, after months or years of therapy, I see these same young people straighten their posture, find their voice, and begin to rebuild their lives, I feel that the cycle is complete. The pain that once consumed me now fuels the healing of others. My daily routine is calm and structured, something I value immensely after the years of chaos and uncertainty of my youth. I wake up early with the first birdsong. I take a light walk around the neighborhood, greeting the neighbors who know Dr. Laura well, as they still call me professionally. I return for a calmly prepared breakfast, usually accompanied by reading the local newspaper or a good book. The mornings are dedicated to my few patients or, when there are no appointments, to writing my second book on therapeutic approaches for survivors of childhood trauma. The first, published 10 years ago, became a reference in many universities. The afternoons I generally reserve for my volunteer work at the New Hope Shelter, an institution I helped found 25 years ago for children in vulnerable situations. There, besides offering psychological support, I organize art therapy workshops and conversation circles where children can express their feelings in a safe and welcoming environment. My connection with my biological family remains strong over the years. Mom, my dear Grace, left us 8 years ago, at 91, after a life dedicated to protecting vulnerable women and children. Her support house in Chicago expanded to 3 units and became a nationally respected NGO. Sarah, my sister, took over as director after Mom's passing and continues the work with the same dedication. Martin pursued a career in law, specializing in family law, and is now a judge in Chicago, always attentive to cases involving abuse and domestic violence. We get together at least once a year, usually at Christmas, alternating between our houses. In these gatherings, the stories of the painful past rarely come up, not because of taboo or denial, but because we learn to honor our journey without letting it define our present. We prefer to celebrate our achievements, our families, the good we managed to extract from the ashes of tragedy. My house in Havenwood reflects the person I have become, cozy but organized, with defined spaces for each activity. My office has walls in soft shades of green, comfortable armchairs, and shelves full of books and small therapeutic objects, sand trays, dolls, art supplies. The living room is dominated by family photographs and gifts made by the grandchildren, framed drawings, small clay sculptures, a patchwork quilt sewn by the eldest granddaughter. The room that was Leonard's I kept intact for almost a year after his passing, until I understood that preserving it that way was not healthy. Today, I've transformed it into a painting studio, a hobby I developed in recent years that has been therapeutic for dealing with grief. I mainly paint landscapes, mountains, forests, rivers, elements of nature that have always brought me peace. The memories of the past still surface, of course. There are moments when a specific smell, a phrase said in a certain way, or a particularly vivid dream briefly transports me back to that cabin number 5. But I've learned to recognize these triggers, to breathe deeply, to anchor myself in the present. The fire, curiously, never scared me again. In fact, I light the fireplace on the cold Illinois winters with a tranquility that would surprise the girl I once was. Perhaps because I understood that fire, like so many things in life, is not inherently good or bad. It is a force that can destroy, but it can also warm, illuminate, transform. My formal identity to the world remains Laura Campos. It's the name on my diplomas, on my professional license, in the dedications of my books. But in my family, among those who know my full story, I am Clara, the girl from Chicago who survived the unimaginable and rebuilt herself from the ashes like a phoenix. There are days when I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't acted in that desperate way on that the 15th of May, 1965. If there would have been another possible outcome, if the official justice system would have worked, I have no answers. Only the awareness that I did what seemed impossible not to do at that moment, with the emotional and psychological resources that a traumatized teenager possessed. What I know for sure is that the path since then, the escape, the new beginning, the gradual return to my identity, the building of a life dedicated to helping other survivors taught me that we are stronger and more resilient than we can imagine. That scars, though they never completely disappear, can become marks of honor that tell the story of our survival. And perhaps most importantly, I learned that our past, no matter how painful, does not need to determine our future, that there is always a possibility to start over, to heal, to transform. This is the message I bring to my patients, to the youth at the shelter, and to anyone who needs to hear that yes, there is life, a good, full, and meaningful life, even after the deepest darkness. The fire I ignited at 15 was not an end, but a forging. That wild, destructive blaze did not die out. It simply retreated within me, transforming from a wildfire of survival into a steady, warm hearth. For decades, this inner flame has been my guiding torch, its warmth thawing the shivering souls who found their way to me. Now, in the quiet winter of my life, I am no longer the girl running from the fire. I am the woman who calmly tends the hearth, ensuring its light never fades. My story is just one of countless tales reborn from the ashes. If this journey has touched you, please subscribe and share so that more flames of hope can be kindled in the darkness.